We begin the Gemara today in the bottom of Daf Ches Amud Beis. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Got it? Okay. Amar Rabbi Elazar said the following halacha. Ha'omer Pesach Pasuach Matzasi. A man gets married and he comes and he says Pesach Pasuach Matzasi, meaning that he entered into an opening which was not closed. In other words, the wife that he got married to was not a basula. Before in the Gemara, the main thing the Gemara focused on regarding figuring out if she's a psula or not is the blood. If there's any blood that comes out, the dam besulim. But here, there's actually another way to know whether she's a psula or not, and that is if the Pesach was closed, which means that there was a hymen there that was blocking his entry, so then he knows she's a basula. Right. So he comes the next day and he says, Pesach Pasuach Matzasi, he says that it was open and therefore she was not a basula. Zok the Gemara, Neman la'oisra olav. If he says this, he's believed and she will become asr to live with him. And why would she be asr to live with him? So if she had a relation with someone else willingly between the Eidison and the Nisuin, as we've learned so many times over here, that the Eidison, she becomes a total Eishes Ish, and then the actual Nisuin, when the husband and wife live together, could be up to a year later. So then, if in that time period she had a relation with someone else willingly, she was an Eishes Ish, she may not go back to her husband. So when he says Pesach Pasuach Matzasi, he's believed to say this. Now Rashi brings up an obvious question. Taisa speaks about it as well. What happened to the issue of the blood? Was there any blood when they had this first relation or not? Why are we ignoring that? So Rashi says, based on the Gemara later, that either she comes from a certain family, which is called a family, a Durkati family, that has no blood. There's no dam besulim. That was the nature of these girls. Or, Rashi says, the blood is not here. It's not available. Even if there was a sheet that they had that they could have seen if there was blood there or not, but it's lost. So that's not a factor that they could look to see if she was a basula or not. So therefore, the only thing is that he's saying that Pesach Pasuach Matzasi, and therefore she's not a basula.
But the hymen also could have just not been there for some reason. He's shooting himself in the
okay, so there's a lot of different details to this that's going to be on this blot, some today, some of the Gemara later. Let's see things at one point at a time. Okay, so now the first thing the Gemara asks is Ve'amai, we're at the top of Amud. Ve'amai, why is he believed to ask her upon her himself? Sfek Sveikehu. There's still a double suffix over here whether she should be asked to him. Why? First of all, Safik Tachtov, Safik Ein Tachtov. If she had a relation with someone else, this could be after she became an Eishes Ish, after the Eidison, or it could be before. So Lavdaf, if it was before, so then she doesn't become Asatim. And even if she had a relation with someone else after she was already an Eishes Ish, after the Eidison, Safik Bainis, possibly this could have happened against her will. And in such a case, the halacha by a Yisrael that marries a woman and she had a relation with someone else as an Eishes Ish, if it was ba'ainis, she can still live with him. Right. And Safik Beratzen, but it could have been Beratzen. And then she would be also to be married to him. So we have a double Safik here. And by a Sfek Sveike, you don't become Asa. This is a famous klal. This is one of the things that Daf Tes and Kesubos is famous for, this rule of Sfek Sveike, that at any time, even though usually we know by Safik Menatayre is L'chumra, anytime you have a suffix regarding any isim in Atayra, you have to be machmer. But if it's a double suffix, a svek sveikim in Atayra, you're not machmer. There's different tesbein for this. One of the famous explanations of the Rashba. The Rashba says that a svek sveike, so you basically have a roiv that she's mutter. Because if you have a double suffix that you're relying upon to answer her, so that means that most stadim say that she's actually mutter. So therefore, there should be no reason to answer her on you. So the Gemara answers, lo yitzriche. The case over here is, there's only one suffix. Ve'eshes kayin. She's a wife of a kayin, and therefore by a kayin the halacha is different. By a kayin, if his wife has a relation with someone else, whether it's ba'inus, whether it's beratzen, she's asked to go back to her husband, the kayin. And that's what we're speaking about, there's one suffix. So let me just explain another very fundamental thing for this Gemara. But the question would still remain, how could he answer her on himself? You have no eidim here. Usually when it comes to such a kind of thing, you have to have eidim to answer upon yourself. Over here, it's just him saying so. So how does she become Asa? Yeah. So Rashi says this is based on something that the Gemara says in many places. It's actually here later in Kesubos. Shavya nafshei araleh chatichadi surah. A person is believed regarding himself. If you say, I know for a fact that she was not a basula and therefore she had a relation with someone else, and there's a suffix about this, it possibly was after she was an Eishes Ish, you can make something Asa for yourself. Even if for other people this would not be aser, but for yourself, shavya alei chaticha d'yisura. If a person comes along and says, I know for a fact that this piece of meat here was not shechted. I know for a fact, I saw that it was an avela. It'll become aser for himself. So over here as well, what the Gemara is saying is that for himself, she's going to be believed. He's going to be believed, that is. This is one shot. One second. This is one shot. You by say, another shot here is Beishish Yisrael. It is talking about a wife married to Yisrael. So the question is, don't we have a double suffix whether she's asa to him? So the Gemara says, "V'kagayin the kabel ba avua kiddushin pchusa mibas gimel shanim v'yoyim echad." The case over here is that her father already accepted kiddushin for her when she was 3 weeks. Not 3 days and not 3 weeks. 3 years old. 3 years and 1 day. What's the significance of 3 years and 1 day? So as Rashi here explains, that from that point on, if anyone had a relation with her, so then the besulim will not come back. But if anyone has a relation with a girl that's below the age of 3 years old, so then the besulim grows back. So therefore over here, when you see that she has no besulim, it must be that someone else had a relation with her after she was already married to him. Because he was already married to her when she was 3 years old. If she would have had a relation with her from before, the besulim would have came back. So therefore there's no suffix whether it happened before or after. The relationship for sure happened when she was an Eshes Ish. So you have only one suffix. Was it ba'aynis or was it beratzen? Okay, and the case over here is that we're talking about that right now she's already a gadol. Because Rashi over here points out another thing which we learned in the Gemara in Yavamis. If she was still a ketana, so then the halacha by a ketana is any relation that she has with anybody else other than her husband is considered to be an aynis. Because she has no das b'chlal to decide for herself what she's doing. So it's always considered to be an aynis. So we're talking about this girl which is today a gedayla. And now we know that she had a relation with someone else based on what he's claiming, what he's saying, that she sees a Pesach Pasuach. She had a relation with someone else when she was an Eshes Ish. But it's not clear whether it was ba'aynis or beratzen, whether she's be able to go back to be married to him.
Does she not have das?
Till bas mitzvah, till 12 years old, right? Okay, so this is the halacha of Rabbi Lazar, that the person is believed to, and again, this is based on the concept of Shavya and Avshei Chaticha D'Yisura. A person is believed to make something asa for himself, even if for others we're not going to trust. We're not going to look at this woman as someone that was mezana, as an Eshes, but for himself he's believed to say this, and therefore she'll be asa. Fragt the Gemara, my kamashma. So what was the chiddush of what Rabbi Lazar said here? This idea that a person is believed to asa on himself, Tanina, we learned this already in another Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah as follows: a person says to a woman, Kidashticha, I was Makadisha, you're my wife. V'yay meres, and she says, Lo Kidashtani, never happened. You were never Makadish me. So what's the halacha? Do we believe him or not? Again, so there's no Eidim here, nothing. So do we accept what he said? So l'chayda, no. Why should we accept what he said without any Eidim? So the Mishnah there says, Hi mutarez bekroivav. She will be allowed to get married to any of his relatives. In other words, we don't trust him. We don't consider her to be married to him ever, and therefore she can get married to any of his relatives that would usually be us or your husband's relatives, so they're totally mutter to her. He that said that she got married to him, so he's not allowed to marry any of her relatives. In other words, we believe him. If he says that I know for sure that I married this woman, so again, Shavya Nafshei Chaticha D'Yisura, so for him this is us, and he will not be allowed to marry any of her relatives. So this concept, you see in a clear Mishnah. What was Rabbi Lazar Machadish over here when he comes and says that this woman that I married is not a Basula, she had a relation with someone else? And it says the Gemara, Ma'al Detema, there's a difference. Here's a Chiddush that Rabbi Lazar is saying here. I would think to say, Hasam Devade Kimle. There he comes and says, I was Machadish this woman, that's something that he knows for a fact. So we rely on what he says, and therefore she becomes Asa to him. Or the relatives become asa to him. Aval hacha make him hudule kimle. Over here, it's possible when this person says that when I had a relation with my wife, Pesach Pasuach, that it was opening. Maybe he didn't realize that it was closed. It's not something that he could be 100% sure about. So even for himself, maybe we shouldn't rely on what he's saying, and she should still be mutter to go back to marry him. It's not something which is so clearly and factual that a person could say that he knows for a fact that it was a Pesach Pasuach. So therefore, Kamash Malan, that's what Rabbi Lazar was saying, that if he comes and says, I know for a fact that it was a Pesach Pasuach, and therefore she was not a Basula, he will not be allowed to go back to his wife. But now here the Gemara asks an opposite question that we find in another place that seemingly Rabbi Elazar says that we don't trust a man to aser this wife on himself. Rabbi Elazar say that he could aser her on himself, but for Rabbi Elazar said in a different place as follows. Eina isha neseres al baila. A woman does not become aser to her husband, ela al iske kinu yistira. Only if it's a situation where there was kinu and stira. This is halacha by a saita. The kinu is when he warned her to not go privately with another person, and a stira is when she actually went privately with another person. So only if you have all of the prerequisites which makes a woman into a saita, then she will become aser to him. But otherwise, a woman does not become aser to her husband if we suspect that she had a relation with someone else. So it seems like that Rabbi Elazar here says that there's no reason to aser her on her husband. And then he adds, Ukemaisa shahaya. This halacha is based on the story that happened, and as we'll see here in the Gemara, the story we're speaking about is the story of Bathsheba. When David HaMelech went and had a relationship with Bathsheba in the time of war, so Bathsheba was married to a fellow by the name of Uriah, and there was a time of war, and Uriah went out to fight in the war, and David HaMelech had a relationship with this Bathsheba. So based on that story, he says, we see that a woman does not become aser to her husband. That's the statement of Rabbi Elazar. But what's our question? So how does Rabbi Elazar here say, when a husband comes and says that it was a Pesach Pesuach, that asers her on him? So the Gemara now first explains, wait a minute, this statement that Rabbi Elazar says to here, something doesn't sound right here. Is this a question? Could you understand B'chla what Rabbi Elazar just said? Ma'aser shahaya. What did you say? That how do I know that a woman only becomes aser to her husband with a kinui and a stira, which means the way it's done by a saita? I learned that out from the story of David HaMelech that had a relationship with Bathsheba. So that story that happened, b'kinui stira have, was there any kinui and stira? Her husband Uriah ever warned her? Was there any stira there? There was no situation of a site that was involved in that story over there. So why are we bringing that Ma'aser Shahaya over here?
Retroactive gift.
1 second, let's see everything in the Gemara. We're going to wait for the Gemara to say everything. That's one question. There was no kinui and no stira there. Another question is, mi asrua? Did they aser her to the husband, to Uriah? Did she become aser to Uriah? She didn't become aser to Uriah. As Rashi here brings, what was the story later? Eventually, David went and got married to Bathsheba. If David was allowed to get married to Bathsheba, so that means she wasn't aser to her husband either. Uriah then got killed in the war, and after Uriah got killed in the war, David HaMelech went and married her. If she would have been aser to her husband, she would have been aser to David HaMelech to marry her as well. The halacha in a case where a woman is mezana with somebody during marriage is that she becomes aser to the husband and she becomes aser to the person that was bayal her. So over here, the fact that we know that David HaMelech went and got married to her, that means that she did not get aser to her husband either. And then her husband died, and then David HaMelech was allowed to marry her. So how are we b'chlal bringing that story as the proof for this, that she becomes aser to the husband? She didn't become aser to him at all. Okay, so first the Gemara explains what Rabbi Elazar really said. This is how you have to understand what he said. The way Rabbi Elazar said, the way we understood it before is not exactly correct. We have to understand what he said as follows. This is what he meant to say. A woman will not become aser to her husband, only if it's a case where there was kinui, there was the warning and the stira, she went and secluded herself with someone else, like it is by a saita. And we understand this from the story that happened with David and Bathsheba. There taka was no kinui and stira. She was not warned as a woman of a saita, and therefore v'lo yistira. And she taka did not become aser to David HaMelech. She did not become aser to go back to her husband, but then her husband died in the war, and then she went to David HaMelech and she got married. So from the fact that over there that David HaMelech was allowed to marry Bathsheba, that's the raya that a woman does not become aser to her husband unless you have the prerequisites that there are by a saita. That's what Rabbi Elazar said. So now we come back to our original question. So if so, our question remains, kinui yistira in. It seems like Rabbi Elazar is saying only in a case where you have the proper warning that there is by a saita, then she becomes aser to her husband. Pesach besuach loy. But in a case where a husband comes and says that the relation I had with my wife and there was a Pesach besuach, I see that she had a relation with someone else, that's not enough grounds to aser her to yourself. So how could Rabbi Elazar have said so? So the Gemara answers and says as follows. According to your reasoning here, according to where you're asking this question, Rabbi Elazar said only if there's kinui and stira like there is by a saita, then she'll become aser to her husband, but otherwise not. So are you going to say kinu yistira in only if she got warned with a kinu and a stira, so then she'll be asa to the husband, but edim loy, if there's clear witnesses that are testifying and telling us that she was mizana, that she had a relation with someone else while she was an eshes ish, and it was done beratzen, so you're going to say that then she doesn't become asa to her husband without a warning? There was clear edim. In such a case, for sure we have to trust what the edim say. So therefore you can't deduce from the words of Rabbi Lazar that the case of Pesach Pasuach will not be Yasser. Hachi Kama. When Rabbi Lazar said only if there's the warning, what was Rabbi Lazar coming to say? What was he coming to exclude? So what he was saying was as follows. A woman will not become asa to her husband be'eid echad, if there's only one aid saying that she had a relation with someone else. Ela b'shnei eidim, only if there are two eidim. There are two Eidim saying that she had a relation with someone else, then she becomes asa to her husband. This is the cloud that we learn out. The Rashi here brings the source, just like by money matters, you can't be Maitzi Mamain without two Eidim. So we learn out from, there's the Gzeir Shava of Dover Mi Mamain, just like by money matters, it has to be with two Eidim. Also, to Aser, a woman to her husband, it has to be with two Eidim as well. But v'kinu yistire, however, if it's a case where the husband warned his wife and there was a stira and she went and secluded herself, so there was eidim for that, then afilu be'eid echad nami. So then even if there's only one aid saying that she had a relation with someone else, she'll become asa to her husband. So the whole thing that Belazar was speaking about was regarding a case where you don't have two eidim. When you don't have two eidim, then it's only if it happened like the story of a saita that she becomes asa to her husband. Says the Gemara, Pesach Pasuach Kishnei Eidim Dami. When a person comes and says regarding himself, I'm 100% sure that my wife was not a basula when I had my first relation with her, it's equivalent to two witnesses. For himself, obviously, it's not equivalent to two witnesses to ask her to anyone else. But for himself, if he wants to ask her for himself, we say that his words, he's so sure about it, it's the same like two Eidim. And therefore, we can't deduce from what Abba Lazar said before any contradiction to this.
He can't ask himself as one aid?
Again?
He can't ask himself as one aid?
But in other words, she'll become asa to himself.
He
yeah.
asking her on
yeah.
himself.
Yeah.
Even if he's one aid.
If you want to say he's like one aid, he can say whatever he is. But in other words, the fact that he's certain about this and he's saying that she's 100% asa to me, so it doesn't come into the diuk of what Rabbi Lazar was speaking about. Rabbi Lazar was speaking about another aid that was saying aid is to asa her on someone else. But you on yourself, you're as strong as two aidim. You're so certain about this. Now, going back now to what Rabbi Lazar said regarding David and Bathsheba, the story that happened. The story of David and Bathsheba, why Taka did she not become asa to her husband? And why did she not become asa to get married then later to David HaMelech? So the answer is, over there, what happened? She was married. She was married to Uriah. And she went then and she had a relationship with David HaMelech while she was an Eshes Ish. So she should be asa to David. The answer is, asam oynis have. Over there, the relation between David and Bathsheba was ba'aynis. It wasn't with her consent. And therefore later, when the husband died, so just like she was not asa to her husband in his lifetime because it was ba'aynis, so after he died, she does not become asa to David HaMelech either. And that's why David HaMelech later married her. That's one answer.
As an order, he's the king. He's summoning her. She has no choice.
No. Okay, maybe that's what it is. So it was an aynis. That's one answer. But now the Gemara gives another answer, and that's what you mentioned before. Or what happened in that story with David and Bathsheba is different. What did he say? All those that went out to fight in the war by David HaMelech get krisis kaisav lishtay. They would write a get for their wife. And this is in order that the wife should not be stuck, should not get into any trouble. Let's say he didn't have any children, and he doesn't want her to be stuck with yibum and so on, so he would write a get to his wife. Now, according to Rashi, just a moment, according to Rashi, the case over here is, what kind of get do they write? They write a get that if I don't return alive from the war, then the get should take effect, mei hayoim, which means retroactively the get takes effect from the day that I left. And that's the kind of get that was written for the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, as well. According to Taisus, actually, Rabbeinu Tam and Taisus says that they actually wrote a get without any conditions to it. They wrote a get to their wife, and then when they came back from war, they had to get married again. So this was a full get that was given. The Gemara brings the source from this. How do we know that they would write a get? Your brothers, you should go and find out what's doing with them. This is actually the father of David HaMelech, Yishai, speaking to David when he went to fight Goliath, and he says, you're going to go meet your brothers there, go find out what's doing with them. And also, Vesaruvasam Tikach, their guarantee or their pledge to their wives, you should take away from them. Meaning, get a get from them for their wives. So guys, Gemara explains it. What does this mean? The matters that connect one to another, or the pledge that there is between a husband and a wife, take that from them, get a get from them for their wife. So from there we see that when they went out to war, they would write a get. So when David had a relation with Bathsheba, it was totally permitted, because she had already a get from her husband. Now, according to Taisus, it was mamish, completely permitted, because she mamish had a full get without any conditions attached. Even according to Rashi, that there was a get with a t'nai, but Taisus explains that according to Rashi, the t'nai of the get was that if he dies and doesn't come back from the war, the get takes effect retroactively, mei hayayim. And that's what happened. They ended up dying in the war. Actually, according to the simple pshat of the psukim there, David HaMelech sort of orchestrated that he should die in the war. And then David HaMelech married her. Okay? Again? Later though it comes out that retroactively. That's why it was considered to be an aveda, and there's the tshuva. Okay, I'll go upon him, but then there's the famous Gemara that says David Chatein Elataya. Okay, so we don't exactly know, the deeper pshat of what happened over here, but this is the two pshatim of the story here. Either it happened ba'ainis, says she was mutter to him later, or there was a get, and therefore it was done beheter, and therefore she got married to him. Okay, Tani Rav Yosef, Omar Abaye, that is, Afanan Nami Tanina. This halacha that Rabbi Elazar said that a husband is believed to say regarding his wife, Pesach Pesuach, he comes with a taina and says that she's not a psula, and therefore she's going to become asa to him. We could see this from the first mission that we learned. Psula nisas liyayim revi, so it says, when does a psula get married? On a Wednesday. Liyayim revi she gets married on a Wednesday, but liyayim chamishi loy, but not on a Thursday. What was the reason? My time, mishum mikruri daitis. As we learned before, the reason is because if there's any problems that she's not a psula, we don't want him to calm down about this matter. She might be asa to him. We want him to come to the bezdin the next morning right away. Now, lamai, what are we concerned about if he calms down and doesn't come to bezdin right away? What's the relevance of the fact that the girl that he married is not a basula? If this is a money matter, if you're marrying a woman and you think she's a basula and she turns out not to be a basula, so the whole thing is a mekach tos. The whole marriage never took effect. You don't owe her the ksuba money. You can just send her away. If that's what the subject over here is that he's bringing up to the bezdin, so then why are we so concerned about this? That he shouldn't calm down. So if he calms down and he wants to give her the ksuba money, so let her give her the ksuba money. We're so concerned about this that he might give her money that he doesn't really owe her. If he agrees to give it to her, so let him give it to her. Ella, so what does it mean? We're concerned that this woman might actually be asa to him, and we want him to come to the bezdin the next morning in order for us to be able to clarify this. Is she asa to him or not? And what is he saying? The kata and taina, and when he comes and says an argument about what happened, my love, the kata and taina is Pesach Pesuach. The case over here is that he's saying Pesach Pesuach. He's saying that he had a relation with her and he sees that she's not a basula. That's so. What do we see in our Mishnah? That he's believed to asa her upon himself by saying that it was a Pesach Pesuach. Says the Gemara, not necessarily. The Katayan Tainas Damim. What he's saying is that there was no blood. That's what he's saying. So as we saw before in the Gemara, that's not as much of a chiddush. In the case where he says Pesach Pesuach, the Gemara said before, that's not necessarily something that he could be 100% sure about. He might have thought that it was easy and there was a Pesach Pesuach, but really it was no Pesach Pesuach. When it comes to blood, that's something that you see very clearly if there's blood or not. So maybe the Mishnah was only saying that if he tainas that there was no blood, then we would trust him, that he should become asa to himself, but not regarding Pesach Pesuach. Taisus actually points out, this itself is the reason why the Gemara in the Havamin over here thought that his taina is Pesach Pesuach. Because what does the Gemara here say? That he might calm down. When does a person calm down about something? When he's not so sure about it. So then over time he might calm down. If it's blood that he didn't see, and this is something that he's 100% sure about, blood is something that you can't have any sveikus about this, there wouldn't really be such a concern that he would calm down, because he's 100% sure about this. That's what the Gemara and the Havamin thought, that his taina was that there was no Pesach Pesuach. But the Gemara still says, no, that the taina the Mishnah is speaking about is that he saw no blood, and therefore there's no raya to the chiddush of Rabbi Elazar. Now the Gemara brings another opinion here. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Ha'oime Pesach Pesuach Matzasi. A man that comes and says the next morning that there was a Pesach Pesuach and she's not a Basula, Nemon Lafsida Kesubasa. Not only is he going to be believed to answer her on himself, as we said before, if it's a case where he's a Kayin, as the Gemara explained before, where there's only one suffix, so she becomes Asa to himself. Besides that, he's also going to be believed to not argue and say, I don't only owe you any Kesuba money, because you were not a Basula. So as Rashi pointed out, Rashi says it before already, this is the Chiddush of Shmuel here, and Rabbi Lazar before disagrees with this. Rabbi Lazar holds, when it comes to money, he's gonna be chayiv to give her the money. He's not believed just himself. He's a negayah to come and say that he doesn't owe her the money. He's not believed. There are no two edim about this. By money, you always have to have a pishnayim edim yakim davar. So over here, Shmuel is coming and saying a tremendous chiddush. Not only to answer her upon himself will he be believed, but even regarding the money matter, he's also going to be believed. What's the reason for this that Rashi brings? We'll see this later in the Gemara. There's a certain chazakeh that what he's saying is true. What is that chazakeh? That, what's the lashon of the chazakeh? Rashi says, Ein adam terech besuda mafsida. That if that over here it must be that this woman was a basula before, and he was planning on marrying her as a basula, and now something happened in between over here that's he was unaware of, and that she's not a basula anymore. What are we concerned about? If it's he himself, maybe between the time of the Edison and the Nisuin, he himself over here went and had a relation with her. And that's why she's not a Basula anymore. But that doesn't make any sense. He went and prepared an entire wedding and he spent money and everything. All for what? To come the next morning and to throw her out of the house and to say that she's not a Basula. That makes no sense at all. A person wouldn't go through this whole entire hassle of creating this whole celebration of a wedding and then the next morning to throw her out of the house. So therefore, even though usually by money you need Eidim to be believed regarding a money matter, but over here, we have a very strong chazakeh that we can believe the taina that he says. And there's another important point over here. Don't forget here, we're not believing him regarding this money matter to be mitzi moment. We're believing here regarding this money matter that he doesn't have to pay money. The money is in his pocket. So we're believing him here with this chazakah to be able to keep the money and not give the ksubah. That's the chiddush of Shmuel. Okay, let's continue inside. Amar Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef says regarding this, my kamash mulan. What is the chiddush of what he said here? That we believe him that she should lose her ksubah. Tanina, seemingly this is also something that we learned later in a Mishnah or in a Braisa. It says as follows: Ha'eichel eitzel chamav biYehuda. A person that went to his father-in-law and had a meal there by his father-in-law, where? In the area of Yehuda and Eretz Yisrael. What's unique about this area of Yehuda? So this was mentioned already before in the Gemara. In the area of Yehuda, so even though there are two stages, there's the Edison, which is just giving a ring, and then there's the Kiddush, the Nisuin later, but over there in Yehuda, the minig was that the Chassan and the Kala did have a Yichud at the time of the Edison. And then afterwards they would separate them for a year, and then they would come and get fully married later after the year. But there was a Yichud at the time of the Edison. So again, a person ate by his in-laws in Yehuda, shaloi be'edim, without any witnesses that were there. Eini yachalitin tainas besulim. So he can't later come and say, when he gets married to her, he can't come and say that she's not a besula. It was a Pesach Pesuach. Why can't he say that? Because the minig in Yehuda was that already before he himself had a relationship with her, possibly. Because he was misyached with her before, he can't come and say that she's not a basula anymore, because maybe it's he himself that had a relationship with her. So now the Gemara says, what do we see from this? Yehuda, hudulei matziton. Only in Yehuda we are not going to believe him. Ha begalal, but in other sections in Eretz Yisrael, where he never had a yichud with her, so we're not concerned that maybe he himself had a relation with her. Matziton. We're going to trust him and say when he says that she's not a basula, we're going to trust him. Now, lamai, what are we speaking about over here? Ila Yisraelov. If we're speaking about his taina, that he's saying that she's not a basula because he wants to ask her and say, I'm not allowed to live with her. She's not a basula. And maybe she had a relation with someone else between the Edison and the Nisuin. If that's what the point we're speaking about over here is, how could you make a distinction between Yehuda or Galil? How could you make a distinction in what section in Eretz Yisrael it is, whether the minig was that he was with her privately before or not? It should make no difference. Amai loy. Why should he not be able to ask her upon himself? Again, going back to the point that we said before, why is a husband believed to say regarding his wife that she had a relation with someone else and she's asa to me? Shavya nafshecha tichadi surah. You're believed to say, I know for a fact I had no relation with her and she must have had a relation with someone else and therefore she's asa to me. So whether this is in Yehuda, whether this is somewhere else, if he comes and says, I know for a fact I had no relation with her, she should be asa to him. So you can't make any distinction between one place or another. El olav, this whole distinction between Yehuda or Galil is lahafsida ksubasa. He's coming to make her lose her ksuba money. And over here we say there's a chiluk. This whole svara we had, that there's a chazakah, that a person will not marry this woman and then just throw it out of the house the next day, that we say only in a place where there isn't a minig that he already was secluded with her before, where there's already a yichud before. If there was a place that was a yichud before, there's a very strong reason to believe that he's the one that had a relation with her before. And Rashi says it could even be he had a relation with her before and he thought that she's still a basula. He's not 100% sure about this. Again, when it comes to this subject of Pesach Pesuach, it's not necessarily something that he could be 100% aware about. So therefore, over here in such a case, in Yehuda, where the minig was, that there was a yichud of the chasna and kala before, we can't accept his taina to cause her to lose the ksubah. The katan taina, and he's coming and arguing and saying that she's not a basula anymore. My love, so here the Gemara says the same thing that it said before. My love, don't you think the case over here is the katan tainas pesach pesuach? What he's coming and saying is that she's not a basula anymore because I see that there was a clear opening. And says the Gemara, loy, not necessarily, in such a case, he can't cause her to lose the ksubah because in that's a kind of taina that you can't be 100% sure about. The katan taina is domim. Maybe we would only believe him that she should lose the ksubah only in a case where he says that there was no blood. That's something that's much clearer, only then we'll accept his taina. Okay, this is the conclusion of this part of the Gemara here. As you see here on the page, and Amud Beis, Anan Amud Aleph, there's a lot of taisvisin over here. This is one of the most famous sugis in Shas, when they get to the whole halacha of Sfek Sveike, and regarding all kinds of different chazakis. In this Gemara that we just learned, so I didn't bring up any of the taisis over here, but just to throw out a few points of here, there's all kinds of chazakis that taisis brings up. There's a cheskas heter, that she has a chazaka that she's mutter to her husband. There's a cheskas psula, she has a chazaka that she's a psula from birth. There's other kinds of chazakis. There's cheskas ksheira legehuna, taisis says. At any time you get into situations of sfeikis, especially double sfeikis, there's all kinds of chazakas that we usually fall back upon, certain presumptions we have about our status. And the Gemara doesn't bring up any of those chazakas. So Taisus goes through all of the different chazakas, why the Gemara doesn't bring them up. And also even the whole thing of sfek sveike that the Gemara spoke about, the Gemara only addresses one scenario of sfek sveike. Suffolk whether the relationship was while she was an Eishes Ish or not. Safik whether it was ba'aynis or baratzen. But there's other details of sfeikis that the Gemara does not bring up either. This whole thing of Pesach Pesuach in the first place is a safik, as the Gemara says. He's not even sure when he says Pesach Pesuach, could be it wasn't the Pesach Pesuach. It's still not 100% sure. That's another safik that the Gemara does not address. There's all kinds of sfeikis that Taisus brings up over here. So there's a lot happening here in the Rishonim. Okay.